What if one small act of kindness cost you everything? Emma Carter, a struggling single mother, risks her job by giving a free meal to a homeless man, Lucas. Fired on the spot, she faces an uncertain future, but her decision sparks a ripple effect that transforms not only her life but the entire town. As Emma fights to build a food truck business, Lucas seeks redemption, and an unexpected apology from her former boss changes everything. Curious how one meal can change the whole town? Watch to find out, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to follow Emma's incredible journey. Emma Carter wiped the last bit of sticky syrup from table 7 at Maple Ridge Cafe and sighed as she straightened her apron. The cafe had been her home away from home for the past 5 years, and each morning she arrived before sunrise to prepare for the long day ahead. The pay wasn't great, but it kept her and her 7-year-old daughter, Molly, afloat. Maple Ridge Cafe wasn't anything special, just a small diner in the sleepy town of Cedarwood, where everyone knew your name but rarely asked how you were doing. The place had its quirks, like the worn-out booths that creaked under any weight, and the faint flicker of the neon open sign that hadn't been replaced in years. But for Emma, it was stability, and that's what she needed most. Her boss, Frank Hillman, was a no-nonsense man. Middle-aged and rigid in his ways, he ran the cafe with an iron fist, especially when it came to his rules. No loitering, no free meals, and no exceptions. He believed in running his business strictly, with little room for compassion. For Frank, it was all about the bottom line. The cafe was already busy with the breakfast rush, the smell of frying bacon and freshly brewed coffee filling the air. Emma moved from table to table with the ease of someone who had long ago learned to hide her exhaustion behind a polite smile. As she filled up a coffee mug for Susan, a regular customer who always ordered eggs and toast, Emma couldn't help but notice the man sitting on the bench outside the window. He had been there for weeks, sitting quietly in the same spot every morning. His threadbare coat barely kept the autumn chill from biting, and the hollow look in his eyes told Emma more than words ever could. "Morning, Emma," Susan said as she glanced out the window following Emma's gaze. "He's back again, huh? I feel bad for him, but you know how Frank is about, well, charity." Emma nodded absently. She knew the rules all too well, but every time she saw the man, Lucas, he'd told her, something inside her tightened. Cedarwood wasn't the kind of place where people openly showed compassion to strangers, especially those down on their luck. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas needed someone to care. Lucas Johnson had once been a proud man, a skilled engineer, who worked at a factory in the neighboring town of Eldridge. He had spent his life building things, making them work and finding solutions where others saw problems. But when the factory closed 3 years ago, the steady rhythm of his life collapsed. The job he had relied on for decades disappeared overnight, and with it went his savings, his home, and the life he had built for himself. Sitting outside the cafe in Cedarwood, Lucas pulled his thin coat tighter around himself, trying to block out the cold. His hands, once strong and steady, now trembled slightly from both the chill and the uncertainty of his future. He watched the people inside the cafe, their warm faces laughing and chatting as they ate breakfast. His stomach growled in response, but he ignored it. This had become his routine, sitting outside Maple Ridge Cafe, watching the world move past him while he remained invisible. He wasn't proud of it, but pride had become a luxury he could no longer afford. He glanced up, just as Emma walked past the window, her face kind and thoughtful. She had spoken to him a few times in passing, offering a smile or a kind word when no one else did. Today their eyes met briefly, and he offered her a nod, unsure of what else to say. He didn't want her pity, but there was something about her that made him feel a little less alone. The wind whipped through the small town, sending dry leaves skittering across the sidewalk. Inside the cafe, the warmth of the kitchen contrasted sharply with the cold that seemed to press against the windows like an uninvited guest. Emma could feel the biting chill even from inside, and her thoughts kept drifting back to Lucas, still sitting outside. She had heard pieces of his story from the other waitresses, how he had once been a respected man, but had lost everything when the factory closed. His story wasn't uncommon. Cedarwood had seen its share of downturns, but something about Lucas made Emma's heart ache in a way she couldn't explain. As she poured another cup of coffee for a customer, Emma's eyes flickered toward Frank's office at the back of the cafe. The door was closed, but she could almost feel his presence behind it, watching everything like a hawk. Frank had made his position clear. No handouts, no free meals. His cafe wasn't a charity, and he didn't tolerate rule-breaking. Emma bit her lip, torn between her empathy for Lucas and the reality of her situation. She needed this job. Molly depended on her. Without the steady paycheck from the cafe, they wouldn't make it through the next month. But how could she sit by and do nothing when Lucas was just outside, hungry and cold? It wasn't until the late afternoon, when the lunch rush had died down and the cafe was quieter, that Emma made her decision. Lucas was still outside, his head bowed low against the wind. Something inside her snapped. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to the counter, grabbing a plate of pancakes, eggs, and bacon. Her heart raced in her chest as she looked toward Frank's office, the closed door a reminder of the risk she was taking. "Emma, don't do it," whispered Linda, one of the other waitresses, her eyes wide with concern. "Frank'll fire you for sure." Emma's hand hovered over the plate, but her decision had already been made. She couldn't sit by and do nothing. She picked up the plate and walked toward the door, pushing it open and stepping into the biting wind. Lucas looked up as she approached, his eyes widening in surprise. "Here," she said, handing him the plate. "It's on me." He hesitated, glancing from the plate to Emma, his expression unreadable. "You don't have to do this," he murmured, his voice rough from days of cold and hunger. "I want to," Emma replied firmly. "Just eat, okay?" Lucas took the plate with trembling hands, his eyes softening as he muttered a quiet thank you. Emma smiled, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the cafe behind her, but the moment was shattered by the sound of the door swinging open violently. Emma turned, her heart sinking as Frank stormed out of the cafe, his face twisted with anger. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Frank's voice cut through the cold air like a whip, sending a jolt of fear through Emma. She stood frozen, her heart pounding in her ears as Frank stalked toward her, his eyes burning with fury. "I told you, no handouts, no exceptions." He was practically shouting now, and the few customers inside the cafe had gone silent, their eyes wide with shock. "I paid for it with my tips," Emma stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't for free. I don't care what you used." Frank's voice rose even higher, his face flushing red. "You broke my rules. That's theft, Emma. You're fired. Right here, right now." The words hit her like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of her. Fired. Just like that. Her chest tightened, and she could feel the eyes of everyone in the cafe on her, but no one said a word in her defense. Frank pointed toward the door. "Get out. I don't want to see you in here again." For a moment, Emma couldn't move. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on her like a boulder. She needed this job. How would she take care of Molly without it? But there was no begging, no pleading. Emma refused to give Frank the satisfaction. With her head held high, she walked back into the cafe, her legs trembling beneath her. She could feel the judgment in the air, the quiet murmurs of the customers who had just witnessed her public humiliation. In the back room, Emma gathered her things with shaking hands, the tears she had held back threatening to spill. She didn't let them. She wouldn't cry, not here, not in front of these people. When she walked out of the cafe for the last time, Lucas was still sitting on the bench, the empty plate next to him. He stood up when he saw her, his face filled with shame and gratitude. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean for this to happen." Emma forced a smile, though it felt brittle. "It's not your fault," she replied quietly. "It was the right thing to do." With that, she turned and walked away, the cold wind biting at her cheeks. She had no idea what she was going to do next, but deep down she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't regret that single act of kindness. The world outside the cafe seemed colder, crueler, and unwelcoming. Emma Carter trudged home through Cedarwood's narrow streets, each step feeling heavier than the last. She clutched her jacket tighter around her body, but it did little to protect her from the biting wind or the looming dread in her heart. Fired. The word echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Her job at Maple Ridge Cafe had been everything. It wasn't just a paycheck. It was the way she managed to keep the lights on in their tiny apartment, the way she paid for Molly's school supplies, groceries, and all the little things that added up to survival. Now, she had nothing. By the time she reached the front door of her small apartment, her legs felt like lead. Molly would be home from school soon, and Emma didn't know how she would break the news to her daughter. Molly was only 7, but she was perceptive, always noticing when something wasn't right. Emma couldn't hide her emotions from her for long. Inside, Emma dropped her bag by the door and sank into the worn couch, covering her face with her hands. She felt the weight of the world crashing down on her shoulders. What was she going to do now? Jobs were hard to come by in Cedarwood. The cafe had been her lifeline, and now it was gone, ripped away in an instant because she'd tried to help someone in need. Her mind raced, spiraling through her options, but none of them seemed promising. She could apply for unemployment, but it wouldn't be enough to cover all the bills. She could try to get another waitressing job, but Frank Hillman had connections with all the local businesses, and the town was small. Word of her firing would spread fast, and no one would want to hire someone who had crossed Frank. A loud bang shook Emma from her thoughts, followed by the excited voice of her daughter as the front door burst open. "Mommy, I'm home," Molly called out, dropping her backpack on the floor. She rushed into the living room with the boundless energy only a 7-year-old could possess. Emma forced a smile, sitting up and brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Hey, sweetie, how was school?" Molly's eyes lit up as she launched into a story about her day, something about recess and a new friend she'd made. Emma tried to focus, nodding along and asking questions, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the cafe and how she would tell Molly the truth. How could she explain that they might not be able to afford much for a while, or worse, that they might lose their apartment? As Molly babbled on, Emma's heart ached. She couldn't let her daughter down. She wouldn't. While Emma struggled to hold it together, Lucas Johnson sat alone in the alley behind the cafe, staring at the empty plate she had given him just hours before. The meal had been the first real food he'd had in days, but now it felt like lead in his stomach. He hadn't wanted to take it from her, but hunger had won out over his pride. Now she has lost her job because of him. The weight of guilt pressed down on Lucas, making it hard to breathe. He had always been a man of pride, a man who worked hard and earned everything he had, but that life was long gone. After losing his job, his home, and his dignity, he had become just another invisible figure on the streets of Cedarwood, ignored by the same people who once respected him. Except for Emma. She was different. She saw him, she spoke to him, and now she had paid the price for her kindness. Lucas wanted to find her, to tell her how sorry he was, but he didn't even know where she lived. And what good would an apology do anyway? He had nothing to offer her, no way to make things right. The town around him moved on, indifferent to his pain, just as it had been indifferent to his fall from grace. But Lucas couldn't ignore it. He couldn't ignore the way Emma had looked at him, not with pity, but with empathy. She had seen him as a person, not a problem. And now, because of him, her life had just gotten harder. Lucas stood up, the wind biting at his face as he wandered the streets aimlessly. He had no destination, no plan. He was just trying to escape the gnawing guilt that followed him everywhere. The next morning, the town was abuzz with whispers about what had happened at Maple Ridge Cafe. The incident hadn't gone unnoticed, and people began to talk. Some were sympathetic toward Emma, saying she had done the right thing by helping Lucas. Others were less forgiving, siding with Frank Hillman's strict no-charity policy. At the local grocery store, two women chatted quietly as they picked out apples. "I heard Emma Carter got fired for giving food to that homeless man," one woman said, shaking her head. "She's always been so kind. It's a shame, really." "Yeah, but you know how Frank is," the other replied. "Rules are rules. She knew what she was getting into." Their conversation was overheard by a young woman at the next aisle. Samantha Davis, a local journalist for the Cedarwood Gazette, had been at the cafe the day Emma was fired. She had seen the whole thing unfold but had stayed quiet, unsure of what to do at the time. Now, as she listened to the women discuss the situation, her journalistic instincts kicked in. Samantha had always believed in using her platform to shed light on important stories, and something about Emma's situation stuck with her. It wasn't just about a waitress losing her job. It was about the larger issue of compassion, of how people treated those in need. That afternoon, Samantha sat at her desk, typing furiously. The words flowed easily as she recounted the events at the cafe, framing the story around Emma's act of kindness and the unjust consequences she had faced. She wrote about Lucas, too, and the town's attitude toward people like him, those who had fallen on hard times and were often ignored by society. The headline read, "One Meal, One Town, and the Cost of Compassion." Samantha's article was published in the Sunday edition of the Cedarwood Gazette and quickly gained traction. People shared it on social media, and soon it became the topic of conversation in coffee shops, grocery stores, and community meetings across town. For the first time, people started to see Emma's actions as a reflection of something deeper, something that needed to change in their town. Meanwhile, Emma was unaware of the growing support. She had retreated into herself, trying to figure out what to do next. She spent hours filling out job applications, but the responses were slow, and the fear of falling further behind on bills loomed large. The refrigerator was nearly empty, and every trip to the grocery store felt like a painful reminder of how little money she had left. Molly noticed the tension, of course. Children were more perceptive than adults often gave them credit for. One night, as Emma tucked her daughter into bed, Molly looked up at her with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, are we gonna be okay?" she asked softly, her little hand gripping Emma's tightly. Emma's heart clenched. She wanted to reassure Molly, to tell her that everything would be fine, but the truth was she didn't know if it would be. "Of course, sweetie," Emma said, forcing a smile. "We'll figure it out. I promise." Molly nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, but as Emma left her daughter's room, the weight of her lie pressed down on her like a lead blanket. She stood in the hallway, her hands trembling as she covered her face. Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time since losing her job, she allowed herself to cry. The sound of her own sobs filled the empty apartment, and in that moment, Emma felt truly alone. The weight of the world was crushing her, and she didn't know how much longer she could hold it up. The following day, Emma received an unexpected knock at the door. When she opened it, she was surprised to see Officer Jake Harris, a local police officer she knew from around town. Jake was a kind man, always polite and friendly, but Emma had no idea why he would be visiting her. "Morning, Emma," Jake said, tipping his hat slightly. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" Emma hesitated, unsure of what this was about, but she stepped aside to let him in. Jake entered the small apartment, looking around as if searching for the right words. "I read the article in the Gazette," he began, his voice gentle, "about what happened at the cafe." Emma stiffened, her mind flashing back to that humiliating day. "Yeah, I figured people would be talking about it." "They are," Jake said with a nod. "But I wanted to tell you something in person. What you did for Lucas was the right thing, Emma. A lot of people in this town agree with you, even if they're too afraid to say it out loud." Emma blinked, taken aback by his words. I couldn't sit by and do nothing." Jake smiled warmly. "That's what makes you different. This town could use more people like you." He paused for a moment, then added, "I'm not here to just talk. I want to help." Emma's heart skipped a beat. "Help how?" Jake explained that there were resources in town for people in Emma's situation. He mentioned local grants and support programs for women starting businesses, and he even suggested that Emma consider opening her own food truck. The idea caught Emma off guard. Her own food truck? It seemed impossible, like a distant dream she could never afford. But Jake's encouragement sparked something in her, a small glimmer of hope that had been buried beneath the weight of her worries. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this disaster into an opportunity. The idea of owning her own food truck lingered in Emma's mind long after Officer Jake Harris left her apartment. At first, it felt like a pipe dream, something distant, unattainable, especially with her finances in ruins. She had always been a waitress, taking orders, cleaning tables, living paycheck to paycheck. Running a business seemed impossible, especially without any money. But what if it wasn't? For the next few days, Emma found herself quietly entertaining the idea. Between filling out job applications and scouring the classifieds, she researched what it would take to start a small business. A food truck seemed like the most feasible option. Low overhead compared to a brick-and-mortar restaurant, flexibility in location, and the ability to run the business on her own terms. She began sketching out ideas in a worn notebook. Nothing concrete yet, just thoughts about what kind of food she would serve, how she would brand her truck, and what she could do to make it affordable for everyone, even people like Lucas. Late one night, after Molly had fallen asleep, Emma sat at her kitchen table staring at her computer screen. She typed small business grants for women into the search bar and hit enter. To her surprise, dozens of results popped up. Grants for women entrepreneurs, for minority business owners, for people in financial hardship. Maybe there was hope after all. With renewed determination, Emma spent the next week filling out applications. She applied for every grant and financial assistance program she could find, even if the odds felt slim. She also set up a crowdfunding campaign, hoping to raise enough money to get her food truck off the ground. It wasn't easy. Emma hated asking for help, but she knew she couldn't do this alone. While Emma was busy building her dream, Lucas Johnson was struggling with his own battle. The guilt he felt over Emma's firing still gnawed at him, but something had changed in him after that day at the cafe. He had spent so long being invisible, living in the shadows of Cedarwood streets, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be seen, to be treated with dignity. Emma had seen him, and that simple act of kindness had ignited a spark in Lucas that he hadn't felt in years. He didn't want to be a burden. He didn't want to live like this anymore. For too long, he had let his circumstances dictate his life, but now he wanted to change. He wanted to work again, to be useful, to regain the pride he had lost when the factory shut down. One morning, as he sat on the same bench outside the cafe, Lucas noticed the familiar figure of Emma walking by. She hadn't been back to the cafe since she was fired, and it was clear she had been avoiding the place. Lucas stood up, hesitating for a moment before calling out to her. "Emma?" She turned, her eyes widening slightly when she saw him. "Lucas," she said, surprised. "I didn't expect to see you." Lucas rubbed the back of his neck, feeling awkward. "I've been thinking. I want to help. I heard you're starting a food truck." Emma blinked in surprise. "How did you—" "Word gets around," Lucas said, offering a small, sheepish smile. "Look, I know I'm not in the best shape, but I want to work again. I want to help you with the truck. I don't have much to offer, but I can fix things. I can clean. Whatever you need." Emma stared at him for a long moment, her heart swelling with emotion. She saw the sincerity in his eyes, the same sincerity she had seen the day she gave him that plate of food. Lucas wasn't just asking for a handout. He was asking for a second chance. "I don't know what I'm doing yet," Emma admitted, "but if you're serious, I could use the help." Lucas nodded firmly. "I'm serious." And so they began to work together. Every day, Lucas would meet Emma at her apartment, helping her with whatever tasks needed to be done. He wasn't just helping her with physical labor. He became her sounding board, someone she could talk to about her fears and doubts. Slowly, piece by piece, they both began to heal. With Lucas's help, Emma was able to make more progress than she had expected. They scoured online listings for affordable used trucks, and after weeks of searching, they found one. A beat-up, rusty old thing that had once been a taco truck but was now sitting abandoned in a junkyard outside Cedarwood. It needed a lot of work, but the price was right. Emma took a deep breath when she saw the truck for the first time. It was far from perfect, and the repairs it needed felt overwhelming. But when she looked at it, she saw something more: potential. Lucas grinned when he saw it. "This thing's got character," he said, running his hand over the faded paint. "We can make it work." They bought the truck with what little money Emma had managed to save from donations and grants, and the real work began. Every day, Lucas worked on the mechanical repairs while Emma focused on cleaning and planning the menu. The process was slow, and there were days when it felt like they would never finish. There were setbacks, more repairs than they had anticipated. Delays in getting the necessary permits, but they pushed through, determined to see it through. The community started to take notice. Word spread about Emma's food truck project, and neighbors and townspeople who had read about her in the Cedarwood Gazette began to chip in. Some donated money, others volunteered their time, and a few even brought supplies. Emma was overwhelmed by the support. After everything that had happened, she had thought she was alone in this fight. But now she saw that people cared. They believed in her, in what she was trying to build. As the food truck neared completion, not everyone was happy about Emma's progress. Frank Hillman had noticed the growing buzz around town about Emma's new venture, and it left a bitter taste in his mouth. His cafe had been a hit ever since the article about Emma was published, with regular customers slowly drifting away. The article had painted him as a villain, and while he had always prided himself on his no-nonsense approach, the loss of business was starting to affect him. The thought of Emma, the woman he had fired, now building a successful food truck right under his nose, made Frank's blood boil. He had always been a man of rules, and to him, Emma had broken one of the most important ones. In his mind, she didn't deserve success. One afternoon, Frank made a call to a friend in the town's planning department, hoping to find a way to block Emma's food truck from getting its final permit. He had connections, and he wasn't above using them to get what he wanted. "I need you to hold off on approving that permit," Frank said, his voice hard. "She doesn't have the experience to run a business like this. It's for her own good." But things didn't go as smoothly as Frank had planned. His attempts to delay Emma's progress only stirred up more attention from the town, and people began to talk about his underhanded tactics. Samantha Davis, the journalist, got wind of Frank's interference and decided to look into it, writing another article exposing Frank's actions. The backlash was swift. Frank's reputation, already tarnished, took another hit as people rallied around Emma, accusing him of trying to sabotage her success out of spite. As the situation escalated, Lucas couldn't stay quiet any longer. For months he had watched Emma work tirelessly to build something from nothing, and he wasn't about to let Frank tear it all down. Lucas had always been a quiet man, keeping to himself, but now he felt a fire burning inside him, a need to stand up for the woman who had helped him when no one else would. One evening, as Frank walked out of the cafe after closing, Lucas was waiting for him. The street was quiet, the only sound of the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lucas stepped forward, his hands clenched at his sides. "Frank," he called out, his voice steady. Frank turned, his face darkened when he saw Lucas. "What do you want?" Lucas took a deep breath, his heart pounding. "I want you to leave Emma alone. She's worked hard to build that truck, and you're trying to tear it all down because of your pride." Frank's jaw tightened. "This is none of your business, Lucas. You don't know how to run a business. You don't understand what it takes." "I understand more than you think," Lucas shot back, his voice rising. "I worked for decades, Frank. I know what it's like to build something, to take pride in your work. But I also know what it's like to fall. I've been at the bottom, and I'm telling you, Emma doesn't deserve what you're doing to her." Frank stared at him, his face hard, but Lucas didn't back down. For the first time in years, Lucas felt strong, stronger than he had since before he lost his job, his home, and everything else. He wasn't just fighting for Emma, he was fighting for himself, for his own redemption. "I'm not asking for much," Lucas continued. "Just let her do this. She's earned it." Frank's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He didn't respond immediately, and Lucas could see that his words had struck a chord. But before Frank could say anything, Lucas turned and walked away, leaving the cafe owner standing alone in the cold night. Despite Frank's attempts to slow her down, Emma's food truck was finally ready. The grand opening was set for a Saturday morning, and the town was buzzing with excitement. People had watched her build the truck from the ground up, and now they were eager to see what she had created. Emma stood in front of the truck, taking a deep breath as she looked out at the small crowd that had gathered. Lucas stood beside her, his face calm but filled with quiet determination. Molly was there too, bouncing with excitement, her smile as bright as the morning sun. The truck's logo, Emma's Good Eats, was painted across the side in cheerful, bold letters, and the smell of fried chicken and freshly baked cornbread wafted through the air. As the first customer stepped up to the window, Emma felt a swell of emotion rise in her chest. This was it, the moment she had worked so hard for. It wasn't just about the food, it was about everything she had been through, everything she had overcome. She handed the customer a plate of food, her hands steady but her heart pounding with excitement. The crowd clapped and cheered, and for the first time in months, Emma allowed herself to truly believe that she had made it. The grand opening of Emma's Good Eats had been a success beyond Emma's wildest dreams. The line of customers didn't dwindle for hours, and every plate of food she served was met with smiles and compliments. People who hadn't seen her since her firing at the cafe approached her with words of encouragement and pride. Emma felt like she had finally found her footing again. Molly's giggles as she ran around the truck, beaming with pride, only deepened the joy in Emma's heart. But behind the scenes, Frank Hillman was seething. From inside the dimly lit cafe, he could see the crowd gathered around Emma's food truck. His cafe, which had once been bustling with regulars, now had only a handful of customers scattered across the tables. The lunch rush that had always been a steady flow of diners was now eerily quiet. People had turned their backs on Maple Ridge Cafe, and Frank knew it was because of Emma, or more precisely, because of what she had made people see about him. Frank stared out the window, his hands clenched into fists. He couldn't believe the audacity of it all. The town siding with her, ignoring his years of service to the community. It wasn't fair. She had broken the rules, defied his authority, and now she was being rewarded for it. In a fit of frustration, Frank made one last desperate phone call to the health department, lodging a formal complaint against Emma's food truck. He claimed there were health code violations, hoping to shut her down before she could gain any more momentum. It was a petty move, and deep down, Frank knew it. But his pride wouldn't let him sit by and watch Emma succeed. A week after the grand opening, Emma's food truck was thriving. Word of mouth spread quickly in Cedarwood, and customers were lining up for her soul food. She had a steady flow of business, and the community support was overwhelming. Even local vendors began to offer her discounts on ingredients, happy to be part of her growing success. Lucas, who had been helping Emma with everything from repairs to serving customers, had found new purpose in his life. He smiled more now, spoke more confidently, and even began to reconnect with people in town who had once known him before he fell in hard times. He felt like he was part of something again, something that mattered, but their joy was short-lived. One afternoon, as Emma was preparing for the lunch rush, a health inspector arrived at her truck. He introduced himself politely, but carried with him a clipboard and a stern expression that immediately made Emma's stomach churn with anxiety. "I'm here to conduct an inspection," he said, holding up his badge. Emma blinked in surprise. "I wasn't expecting an inspection today." "It's a routine check," the inspector replied, though his tone suggested otherwise. He began walking around the truck, checking everything from the cleanliness of the cooking area to the storage of ingredients. Emma followed him, her heart pounding in her chest. She had been meticulous about keeping the truck spotless, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When the inspection was over, the inspector handed Emma a notice. "There are a few minor violations that need to be addressed," he said. "You'll need to shut down for a few days until these issues are resolved." Emma felt the ground shift beneath her. "Shut down?" she repeated, her voice shaky. "But what violations?" "Nothing major," the inspector assured her. "But regulations are regulations. You'll need to make the necessary corrections before reopening." Emma stared at the notice in her hands, her mind racing. This was Frank's doing. She was sure of it. He had found a way to strike back, to undermine her success. The thought made her blood boil, but there was nothing she could do. The food truck had to be closed for the time being. As the inspector walked away, Emma stood frozen, her hands trembling. Lucas approached, concern etched on his face. "What did he say?" Lucas asked quietly. "We have to shut down," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible, "for at least a week." Lucas looked at her, his expression darkening with anger. "Frank. This has to be Frank." Emma nodded, her eyes filled with frustration and helplessness. "I know it's him, but what can we do? We can't fight city regulations." For the first time since starting the truck, doubt began to creep into Emma's heart. What if this was the beginning of the end? What if Frank kept finding ways to sabotage her, to push her out of business? She couldn't afford to be shut down for long, not with bills piling up and Molly depending on her. The next few days were some of the hardest Emma had faced since being fired from the cafe. The food truck sat idle, parked in the same corner but closed, with a sign on the window explaining the temporary shutdown. Emma's savings were already stretched thin, and the idea of not being able to work, even for a week, filled her with anxiety. Molly, who didn't fully understand what was happening, asked Emma every day when the truck would reopen. Emma forced a smile, telling her daughter they were just taking a break for a few days. But the town of Cedarwood was watching. Word spread quickly about the health inspection and the forced closure, and people began to speculate about Frank's involvement. While Emma had kept quiet, refusing to make accusations, others in town weren't so discreet. "It's Frank's doing," one customer muttered as she passed by the truck. "Can't believe he'd stoop this low." Emma did nothing but help this town, and this is how she gets treated? Samantha Davis, the journalist who had covered Emma's story from the beginning, took notice of the growing outrage. She decided to write another article, this time digging deeper into the allegations that Frank Hillman had used his connections to sabotage Emma's food truck. The article, titled "Sabotage in Cedarwood, a Local Business at Risk," detailed the health inspection and the rumors swirling around Frank's interference. It didn't take long for the town to rally behind Emma once more. Local business owners, many of whom had offered Emma discounts on ingredients, began to speak out in support of her. They organized a fundraiser to help Emma cover the costs of any repairs or improvements she needed to make to get her food truck back up and running. When Emma heard about the fundraiser, she was stunned. People were coming together for her, people she barely knew, and it gave her the strength to keep going. One afternoon, as Emma was cleaning up the truck and trying to prepare for the reopening, she heard a knock on the side of the truck. She turned to see Frank Hillman standing there, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, looking more unsure of himself than she had ever seen. Emma's heart raced. What was he doing here? "Can I talk to you?" Frank asked, his voice unusually quiet. Emma hesitated, then nodded. "Sure." Frank stepped closer, avoiding her gaze for a moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained. I heard about the article." Emma crossed her arms, watching him carefully. "And?" Frank let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I didn't mean for it to get this far. I didn't want to hurt you. I wanted to protect my business." Emma stared at him, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "So you tried to ruin mine?" Frank winced. "I made some mistakes, Emma. I thought I was doing the right thing at first, but I realize now that I wasn't. I know what people are saying about me, and they're not wrong." There was a long pause as Emma processed his words. She had spent months feeling betrayed, humiliated, and angry at Frank. But now, seeing him like this, vulnerable, admitting his mistakes, she wasn't sure what to feel. Frank glanced up at her, his eyes filled with regret. "I came to apologize. I know I can't fix what I've done, but I want to make things right. I've already called the health department. They'll be out tomorrow to inspect again, and I made sure they'll clear you. No more delays." Emma blinked, taken aback by the unexpected gesture. "Why are you doing this now?" Frank looked away, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because I'm tired of fighting, and because I respect what you've built. I've watched you build something from nothing, and it's more than I ever gave you credit for." Emma let out a slow breath, the anger in her chest beginning to loosen. She still didn't fully trust Frank, but his words felt genuine. She could see the weight of his guilt, the cracks in his pride. "Thank you," Emma said softly, her voice steady. "But don't think this makes everything okay. I'm still going to fight for my business." Frank nodded, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "I know, and you should." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Emma standing there in stunned silence. The next day, the health inspector returned to the food truck, just as Frank had promised. Emma and Lucas stood by anxiously as the inspector went through his checklist, checking every inch of the truck. Emma had made all the necessary adjustments, ensuring that everything was up to code. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the inspector handed Emma the final report. "You're cleared to reopen." Relief flooded through Emma as she read the words on the paper. She had done it. Despite everything, Frank's sabotage, the setbacks, the doubts, she had made it through. Lucas grinned at her, his eyes shining with pride. "Told you we'd get through this." Emma smiled back, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. "We did it." Word spread quickly that Emma's Good Eats was back in business. On the day of the grand reopening, a crowd gathered around the truck, even larger than the one on the first day. People from all over town came to show their support, eager to taste Emma's food and celebrate her victory over adversity. As Emma stood behind the counter, serving plates of fried chicken and cornbread, she felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. She had come so far, fought so hard, and now she was finally seeing the fruits of her labor. Lucas worked alongside her, his hands steady and his spirit renewed. The man who had once been invisible on the streets of Cedarwood was now a vital part of the community, helping Emma build something meaningful. And as Molly ran around, laughing and playing with the other children, Emma knew that this was just the beginning. She had created something not just for herself, but for her daughter and for the town that had rallied around her. In the months that followed, Emma's Good Eats became a beloved fixture in Cedarwood. The food truck wasn't just a place to grab a meal, it was a symbol of resilience, of second chances, and of the power of kindness. People who had once passed Lucas on the street without a second glance now greeted him warmly, treating him as a member of the community. His journey wasn't over. There were still challenges ahead, but he faced them with a renewed sense of purpose and pride. Emma's success inspired others in town, too. A new wave of small businesses began to emerge as people realized that with enough determination and support, anything was possible. And Frank Hillman? He kept his cafe open, though it would never be the same as it once was. He had lost more than just business. He had lost the respect of the community. But slowly, over time, he began to make amends. He became less rigid, more open to change, and though it wasn't easy, he started to rebuild what he had lost. One evening, as the sun set over Cedarwood, Emma sat outside the food truck with Lucas and Molly, watching the last few customers of the day walk away with their meals. The air was cool and crisp, the first hint of autumn in the breeze. Molly curled up next to her mother, resting her head on Emma's shoulder. "Mommy, are we going to keep doing this forever?" Emma smiled, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "I hope so, sweetie. I hope so." Lucas looked out at the quiet street, a soft smile on his face. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Emma nodded, her heart full. "Yeah, we really have." And as they sat there, the lights from the food truck casting a warm glow over the sidewalk, Emma knew that the journey was far from over. There would be more challenges, more setbacks, but she was ready for them. She had found her strength, her voice, and her purpose. Because sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the biggest ripples. The days following the reopening of Emma's Good Eats were a whirlwind of success, but they were also quieter, filled with a newfound peace Emma hadn't felt in a long time. The food truck had become a staple in Cedarwood, with a steady stream of loyal customers coming by every day. The crowd that had gathered during her grand reopening slowly settled into a regular clientele, people who had once passed by now stopping for a meal and conversation. For Emma, it felt like she had finally found her place in the world. She had control over her future, a business that was hers, and a community that stood by her side. The anxiety she once felt, the constant fear of not having enough, of losing everything, was slowly fading. Each day was still hard work, but it was the kind of hard work that left her satisfied at the end of the day, not drained. She had purpose, and that was something she hadn't had in a long time. As she wiped down the counter of the truck one evening, Molly skipped around, playing with the children of customers who lingered by the park nearby. The truck was parked in its usual spot near the small downtown area, where the smell of food wafted through the streets, pulling in late-night wanderers. Lucas was there too, working behind the scenes. His hands had steadied over time, and he moved with more confidence now. He had started coming by the truck earlier each morning, always eager to help with preparations. There was a lightness in him, a man who had rediscovered his sense of purpose. Emma couldn't help but feel proud of the progress they had both made. As the last customer of the night left, Emma sat down on a small stool inside the truck, taking a moment to catch her breath. She glanced at the neat stack of bills in the cash drawer, then at the small tip jar by the window. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Enough to keep her going, to keep a roof over Molly's head, and enough to make her believe that they were going to be okay. Lucas's journey wasn't without its setbacks, but he was growing stronger each day. His work at the food truck had given him stability, a place to be every day, and a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. But his personal struggles, the ones that had begun long before he lost his job at the factory, still lingered beneath the surface. One evening, after the truck had closed for the day, Lucas approached Emma with a serious look in his eyes. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," he said, his voice low. Emma turned from where she had been cleaning, sensing the weight behind his words. "What is it?" Lucas hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been going to counseling. Chief Carter set it up for me a few months ago, around the time you gave me that first meal." Emma felt her heart soften. "I didn't know that. I'm glad, Lucas. I really am." Lucas nodded, his gaze distant. "I needed it. I've been carrying so much around with me for so long, losing the job, my house. It's not just about what I lost. It's about what I couldn't face." Emma stepped closer, her voice gentle. "You've been through a lot. It's okay to ask for help." Lucas smiled faintly, but there was a sadness in his eyes. "I didn't think I'd ever get back on my feet again. But you gave me a chance. More than that, you gave me hope." Emma's throat tightened as she blinked back tears. She reached out, placing a hand on Lucas's arm. "You're not the same man you were when I met you, Lucas. You've come so far." Lucas let out a slow breath, as if releasing a burden he had been carrying for years. "I just wanted you to know that. I wanted to say thank you for not giving up on me." Emma smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for helping me, Lucas. We've come a long way together." In the months following the reopening of Emma's Good Eats, something began to shift in Cedarwood. Emma's food truck had become more than just a place to grab a meal. It had become a gathering place, a symbol of resilience and second chances. The story of Emma and Lucas had touched the hearts of many, and it wasn't long before other members of the community began to step up in their own ways. More small businesses started popping up, inspired by Emma's determination. People who had once felt invisible or overlooked were finding their own paths forward, supported by the town that had, for a long time, turned a blind eye to its struggles. Linda Parker, the local journalist who had written about Emma's story from the beginning, continued to follow the ripple effect Emma had created. Her articles highlighted the positive changes in the community, the new businesses, the outreach programs, and the growing sense of compassion that had taken root in Cedarwood. But one of the biggest changes was in the way people treated each other. The town, which had once been closed off and indifferent, was now more open, more supportive. People noticed each other's struggles more. They offered help, shared resources, and began to see those who had once been invisible. One afternoon, while serving customers, Emma was approached by an older man she didn't recognize. He smiled warmly at her, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said, his voice soft but sincere. Emma blinked in surprise. "For what?" The man chuckled. "For what you've done here. You've changed this town. You've made people see each other again." Emma's heart swelled with emotion. "I just wanted to help." "You've done more than that," the man said, nodding. "You've given us all a reason to be better." As he walked away, Emma stood there, letting his words sink in. She had never set out to change the town. She had just wanted to do the right thing. But now she realized that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could create the biggest waves. Frank Hillman had been watching from the sidelines, his cafe quieter than it had ever been. The damage to his reputation and business was undeniable, but the hardest part for Frank to admit was that he had brought it upon himself. He had let his pride and rigid rules get in the way of seeing people as more than just numbers on a balance sheet. In the weeks after Emma's food truck had reopened, Frank had taken a hard look at himself. He had spent years running Maple Ridge Cafe with an iron fist, refusing to bend the rules no matter what. But now, seeing how Emma had built something out of nothing, with kindness and compassion at the center of it all, he began to realize how wrong he had been. One morning, Frank made a decision that surprised even himself. He closed the cafe early, hung a sign on the door that read, "Under renovation," and walked over to Emma's food truck. When he arrived, the crowd around the truck was light. It was early, and the lunch rush hadn't begun yet. Emma was busy preparing food, and when she saw Frank approaching, her eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Frank," she said cautiously, wiping her hands on her apron, "what brings you here?" Frank shifted awkwardly, his hands in his pockets. "I wanted to talk." Emma crossed her arms, still unsure of his intentions. "About what?" Frank hesitated for a moment, then sighed. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About everything, really. I was wrong. I let my pride get in the way, and I hurt people because of it." Emma's expression softened, though she remained guarded. "I appreciate the apology, Frank, but you've got to understand. What you did made things really hard for me." "I know," Frank admitted, his voice low. "I've lost a lot because of my mistakes, my business, my reputation, but I don't want to lose this town. I've been thinking about how to make things right." Emma eyed him carefully. "How do you plan to do that?" Frank let out a slow breath. "I'm not sure yet, but I want to start by changing how I run the cafe. I want to give it back, maybe even offer meals to people who need them, no questions asked." Emma blinked, surprised by his words. It wasn't the Frank Hillman she had known for years, the strict, rule-bound man who never bent for anyone. This was a man who had been humbled, who was trying to find a way to make amends. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away," Frank continued, "but I hope you'll give me a chance to prove that I've changed." Emma considered his words for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I believe in second chances, Frank, but it's up to you to show this town that you mean what you say." Frank nodded, relief washing over him. "Thank you, Emma. I'll do my best." As Frank turned to leave, Emma watched him go, feeling a sense of closure she hadn't expected. Frank had been a part of her past, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. But now it seemed he was ready to be part of the town's future, a future built on kindness and compassion. Months passed, and Emma's Good Eats continued to thrive. The food truck had become a beloved fixture in Cedarwood, and Emma's life had stabilized in ways she hadn't thought possible. Molly was doing well in school, happy and carefree, and Emma had even started to think about expanding her business, maybe another food truck or even a small restaurant one day. But more than financial stability, what mattered most to Emma was the sense of belonging she felt. She had built something that mattered, not just for her and Molly, but for the entire town. Lucas, too, had come a long way. He had reconnected with his family and was working with local outreach programs to help others who had fallen in hard times. He had become a symbol of resilience in Cedarwood, a man who had once been forgotten, but had found his way back through the kindness of others. One evening, as the sun set over the town, Emma, Lucas, and Molly sat together at a picnic table near the truck, watching as the last few customers finished their meals. Molly, her face sticky from a treat she had been enjoying, looked up at her mother with a wide smile. "Mommy, are we going to keep the food truck forever?" Emma chuckled, brushing a strand of hair from Molly's face. "I don't know about forever, sweetie, but for as long as we can." Lucas leaned back, his arms crossed over his chest, a content smile on his face. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Emma nodded, her heart full. "Yeah, we really have." As they sat there, the warm glow of the food truck lights casting a soft glow over the street, Emma knew that the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges, more obstacles to overcome, but she had learned something important. Kindness, no matter how small, could change everything. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emma allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. She had started this journey with a simple act of compassion, and it had grown into something she could never have imagined. Sometimes, it only took one meal to change the world. If you believe in the power of kindness and love stories of resilience and hope, don't miss out on more inspiring journeys like Emma's. Hit that subscribe button and join a community that celebrates the strength to rise above and the courage to change the world, one small act at a time.